side wearing kind of Palestinian garb and screaming and yelling and having T-shirts, you know, Israel apartheid. And on this side, maybe 100, 150 students with kippot, blue and white, clearly supportive of Israel. And in the middle, 700 or 800 students who were open-minded, who didn't really have an opinion. And so I said, I want to start with a couple of questions before I start my talk. How many of you identify yourselves as pro-Israel? So the students raised their hand. I said, how many of you who identify yourselves as pro-Israel would be willing to accept a Palestinian state living next door, peaceful, no terrorists, no rockets, living in peace? Every single hand went up. I said, now, how many of you regard yourselves as pro-Palestinian? Those hands went up. How many of you who are pro-Palestinian would be willing to accept an Israel state, no expansion, no settlements, living in peace? They all mumbled among themselves. Not a single hand went up. The debate was over. The 700 people in the middle all understood this was not pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. This was pro-Israel, anti-Israel. This group wasn't pro-Palestine. They just hated Israel. They didn't care about a Palestinian state or about the Palestinian people. They wanted there not to be a Jewish state more than they wanted there to be a Palestinian state, which is why there is no Palestinian state. They could have had one in 1937, the Peel Report. They could have had one in 1948, the UN. They could have had one in 1967. They could have had one in 1992. They could have had one in 2000. They could have one today. I challenge anybody to rebut these two propositions. Two propositions of fact. If Israel's enemies were to lay down their arms and stop terrorism, there would be peace. Proposition 2, if Israel were to lay down its arms, there would be genocide. Those are two truthful propositions, and the world has to come to understand that. That's why Israel needs qualitative military superiority, why it needs to maintain and expand its nuclear arsenal, and why Iran shouldn't ever get a nuclear arsenal. Why the only people who should have nuclear weapons are people who won't use them, except in absolute self-defense, not people who would use them aggressively because they want to wipe out another country. I think the situation on college campuses is better than some do. I think that, for example, at Harvard and at Yale, the vast majority of students are pro-Israel. There's a very vocal anti-Israel group. Not true at Columbia. Columbia has a very vocal anti-Israel group with a lot of faculty members. Most of them are Jewish, who are the virulently anti-Israel people on campuses. The same thing is true at Berkeley, not at Stanford, but at Berkeley. Worse, University of San Francisco, one of the worst campuses in the United States. There are other campuses that are very bad, but Tufts, Princeton, Penn, wonderful. Ohio, Michigan, even Michigan, which is in a very Arab area of the country. Generally, the students, I've spoken there, pro-Israel. Where was I prevented from speaking? The University of Massachusetts. But there were 10 students who wouldn't shut up, and they screamed and they yelled, and finally the administration forced them out. Irvine, too. In the end, the administration acted properly. The administration arrested 11 of the students. They are proceeding against them administratively. They clearly violated the standards of the university. They have a right to protest, but they do not have a right to stop a speaker from speaking. And it's happened at a few college campuses, at Concordia in Canada. They wouldn't allow either Benjamin Netanyahu or Ehud Barak to speak. And then they invited me to speak. And I said I would only speak there if they re-invited if they re-invited Ehud Barak and Netanyahu, and that's possibly in the works. So the situation of college campuses is very much in flux. It's not as bad as my friend Natan Sharansky thinks it is, and it's certainly not very good, but it's working fairly well. The big problem is faculty, not students. The students are terrific, and mostly the students are quite supportive. The problem is faculty, particularly in arts and sciences, and in linguistics and other areas, who are rabidly and thoughtlessly anti-Israel in a knee-jerk way. Many of them Jewish. Many of them use their Jewishness as a shield and a sword to try to make arguments. Many of them use unfair methods. They grade students down for answers that are pro-Israel. They won't let students who are pro-Israel speak in class. They assign books that are virulently anti-Israel to the students. When the students try to add supplementary books, they won't accept them. Students have a right to fight back. Students have a right to demand that their courses are fair and balanced, and that they're not used as propaganda vehicles by hard left or hard right anti-Israel professors.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our two authors to come up as one of your questions.
First of all, I agree with you that if Israel were not the Jewish state, it wouldn't be the focus of all this attention. You can call it anti-Semitism, you can call it obsession with Jews, you can call it whatever you want. Look, when 6 million Jews were being slaughtered, nobody cared about Jews. And as soon as Jews got some power to defend themselves, the only thing the world seems to care about is the Jewish state. 6 million additional people have been killed in genocide since the end of the Second World War, while the UN has debated whether Zionism is racism. I mean, look at what happened in 1975. 3 million people were being killed in Cambodia, and the UN wasn't debating Cambodia, it was debating whether Zionism was racism. On the issue of spirituality, it's personal. Personal. Everybody has to make their own choices. Herzl was an atheist. Ben-Gurion was an atheist. I'm not going to speculate about Bibi Netanyahu's religiosity. Israel is a secular Jewish democracy. And the vast majority of Israelis, tragically, are not only not religious, but a large percentage of them are anti-religious. And why? It's a very important reason. In America, secular Jews, I consider myself a post-denominational, generally secular Jew. I love Judaism. I love Orthodoxy. I belong to an Orthodox synagogue. I belong to a conservative synagogue. I belong to a Reform synagogue. I belong to a Reconstructionist synagogue. I'm the faculty advisor at Chabad. I'm also the faculty advisor to the Humanist Society at Harvard, which are Jewish atheists and agnostics. So I love all forms of Judaism, but it's very, very personal. In Israel, if you're not Orthodox, generally you hate religion. Why? Because Israel doesn't have enough separation between synagogue, mosque, church, and state. In that respect, I think it's a terrible mistake to make religion part of a state policy. Religion must come from the heart. It must come from inside. It can't come from outside. You have an absolute right to teach spirituality and to have people encouraged in the spirituality. But I don't want the state to teach spirituality, because when the state does, it becomes corrupt. If you look at what happened with Shas and other religious political parties, what happened to the former Shas leader? He went to jail. Because when the state sponsors religion, money becomes into play. Money gets given to the states, and corruption is breeded. So I want to maintain the separation of church and state in America. I want to maintain the separation of synagogue, mosque, and state in Israel. Israel is a Jewish state, but it is not necessarily a religiously Jewish state. It's a state in which Jews have the freedom. There should be more freedom to practice Judaism. If you happen to be Reform or Conservative Jew in Israel, there's not enough freedom of religion. In fact, the only groups that are discriminated, the only religious groups that are discriminated against in Israel are not Muslims, they're not Christians, they're Jews. They're conservative and Reform Jews who aren't given full and complete status because of the political nature of political parties. So spirituality is an answer for many, but it can't be the governing answer of the state of Israel, because you would never get a consensus about the role of God, the nature of God, and whether Israel is in fact a promised land, or whether Israel is a necessity growing out of the realities of the world. And I think there are very good reasons why Israel should be the Jewish state, whether one believes in spirituality, whether one believes in God or not. So I wouldn't make it the exclusive basis, but it's a very good question.
We're going to